There is a face in the desert that never belonged to the story we gave it. Not a skeleton, not a mask, not a broken artifact pulled from the sand and labeled, catalogued, and forgotten. A face, preserved eyelashes. A felt hat still resting above the brow, skin tightened by 4,000 years of wind, salt, heat, and silence. A mouth closed around a secret the living would spend decades trying to explain. She was found in the Tarim Basin, on the edge of the Tarim Desert, one of the driest landscapes on Earth. And from the moment archaeologists saw her, she seemed to point in the wrong direction. Not east, west. The clothing looked foreign, the wool looked foreign, the economy looked foreign. Even the face itself seemed, to many early observers, impossible to separate from the old story of Indo-European migrants moving across the Bronze Age world. For decades, the explanation seemed obvious. These people, the famous Tarim Mummies, must have come from somewhere else. From the Western Steppe, from the Oasis cities of Central Asia, from the same deep movements that carried herders, animals, languages, and technologies across Eurasia. It was a clean story, a dramatic story. The kind of answer that makes a strange face in a desert feel suddenly understandable, and then ancient DNA entered the grave. What it found did not simply adjust the old explanation, it overturned the assumption underneath it. The Tarim Mummies were never who we thought they were. Not because their story was less strange than the myths surrounding them, but because it was older, deeper, and far more difficult to fit on a map. To understand why this mattered, you first have to understand the place that preserved them. The Tarim Basin sits in the heart of Inner Asia, surrounded by some of the most formidable natural barriers on the planet. To the north rise the Tian Shan Mountains, to the south, the Kunlun, to the west, the Pamirs, to the east, the Altoon Range, and in the middle lies the Taklamakan, a desert so dry that bodies did not always decay there. Sometimes, they waited. The basin was not empty. It was not isolated in the simple sense. Around its edges, rivers descended from the mountains and died into oases. Those green corridors made life possible in a landscape that otherwise seemed designed to erase it. A person could live there. A community could live there. But only by understanding water, animals, seasons, and distance with a precision most settled farmers would never need. Geography did two things here. It preserved the dead, and it confused the living. Because when the bodies came out of the sand, they looked like evidence of movement. The earliest cemeteries associated with the Shaohe horizon contained wooden coffins shaped almost like boats, bodies wrapped in hides and wool, felt hats, leather boots, woven baskets, cattle hides, wooden poles rising from the sand, and grave goods that seemed to echo worlds far beyond the desert. The mummies were too well preserved to feel ancient. They still had faces. And faces are dangerous evidence, because faces make us think we understand ancestry before the bones have spoken. The old theories formed quickly. There were, broadly speaking, three ways scholars tried to explain the Tarim mummies. The first was the Western Steppe hypothesis. Under this model, the people of the Tarim Basin were connected to the Afanasyevo, a Bronze Age pastoralist population related to the wider steppe world. The idea made sense on the surface. The Tarim mummies had wool. They had cattle, sheep, and goats. They lived a pastoralist life in a region that later became associated with Indo-European languages. If they looked Western, dressed in wool, and lived with herds, perhaps they were the eastern edge of a Western migration. The second theory pointed south and west, toward the Oasis Civilizations of Central Asia. The Bactria-Margiana archaeological complex flourished in the deserts and river systems of what are now Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and northern Afghanistan. Its people knew how to survive in arid lands. They built settlements, cultivated crops, managed water, and lived inside a network of exchange that connected deserts, mountains, and river valleys. The Tarim cemeteries also contained plants and practices that seemed to belong to that wider oasis world. Perhaps the Tarim founders had moved from those regions into the basin. The third explanation was more subtle. Maybe the Tarim Basin had not been colonized by a single migrating population at all. Maybe it was a place where cultural ideas moved faster than people. A zone where herding, crops, wool, dairy, ritual objects, and burial customs could travel across mountains and deserts without the wholesale replacement of the people already living there. Each explanation had something going for it. None of them had the body. For a long time, the face did too much of the work. The mummy's unusual appearance pulled the imagination in one direction. The later presence of Tocharian, an Indo-European language family known from manuscripts recovered in the wider region, pulled it further. The material culture seemed to complete the picture. The clothing pointed west, The economy pointed west. The later language history seemed to point west. Then the DNA refused to follow. In 2021, a large international team analyzed genome-wide data from some of the earliest known human remains in the Tarim Basin and from the neighboring Zungarian Basin. This mattered because the two regions had often been pulled into the same story, as if one Bronze Age migration could explain them both. It could not. The Zungarian individuals did show ancestry connected to Western steppe herders. That part of the old map was real. The steppe had moved east. The Afanasyevo connection was not imaginary. It existed north of the Tarim world. But the Tarim mummies were different. The researchers expected movement. They found isolation. They expected migrants. They found survivors. The earliest Tarim individuals did not fit the Afanasyevo steppe model. They did not fit the BMAC Oasis model. They did not show the substantial Western Eurasian ancestry that earlier theories had expected. Instead, they formed a remarkably homogeneous and genetically isolated population, one that had passed through a deep bottleneck and preserved an ancestry profile almost nowhere else visible in the Bronze Age world. The core of that ancestry was ancient North Eurasian. To understand why that is so strange, you have to go much further back than the Bronze Age, further back than the Silk Road, further back than the First Empires, further back than writing, cities, farming, or even the end of the Ice Age. Ancient North Eurasians were a Pleistocene population once spread across parts of northern Eurasia. Their genetic legacy survives today only in fragments, scattered across later populations in Siberia, the Americas, Europe, and Central Asia. But by the time the Tarim mummies were alive, populations carrying such a strong ancient North Eurasian signal as a distinct community were thought to have largely vanished from the visible record. And then, in the sands of the Taklamakan, one appeared, not as a ghost hidden inside another people's genome, as bodies, as faces, as people buried in boat-shaped coffins beneath wooden poles, wrapped in the technologies of a connected world, yet carrying a genetic inheritance from a world much older than the one around them. This is the part that makes the Tarim mummies so difficult to simplify. They looked like evidence of migration, but their DNA looked like evidence of survival. They were not proof that Bronze Age Europeans had suddenly appeared in the desert. They were not a simple colony of steppe herders. They were not merely an eastern branch of an Indo-European expansion. They were, according to the ancient DNA, a local and isolated population whose roots reached into one of Eurasia's deepest prehistoric layers. The textbooks were not wrong because they were careless. They were wrong because the bodies appeared to tell one story, and the genomes told another. And when the face points one way, but the genome points another, that is not confusion. That is the signal. The first signal was the absence. No expected steppe ancestry. No simply BMAC origin. No neat replacement event. Then came the second signal, and it was even stranger. The Tarim people were genetically isolated, but they were not culturally isolated. Their bloodlines remained tightly bounded, but their way of life was built from ideas, foods, animals, and technologies that came from everywhere. They consumed dairy from cattle, sheep, and goats. They used wool. They cultivated or consumed crops, such as wheat and millet, plants whose deeper histories point in different directions across Eurasia. They used ephedra, a plant known from wider Central Asian contexts. They made cheese-like dairy products, despite apparently lacking the genetic variants that would make adult milk digestion easy. Their genes stayed still. Their culture moved. Or perhaps more accurately, their ancestors remained local, while the world reached them. This is what the old migration models failed to see clearly. The Tarim Basin was not simply a place people entered, it was a place ideas entered, a place where mountain corridors, desert oases, river systems, and pastoralist networks carried technologies across great distances. A population did not need to be replaced in order to be transformed. The Tarim people could remain genetically isolated and still drink milk from animals whose domestication history began somewhere else. They could wear wool without being descended from the people who first spun it. They could bury their dead with objects and symbols that echoed distant cultures without being migrants from those cultures. This is the deeper lesson of the Tarim mummies. Culture is not blood. Technology is not ancestry. A grave good is not a passport. For decades, people looked at wool, cattle, dairy, faces, and later language history and thought they were seeing a migration. What ancient DNA revealed was more complicated. The Tarim Basin was not outside the Bronze Age world. It was part of it, but it participated in that world without being genetically absorbed by it. That is rare, and rare things tend to look impossible until the evidence finally has a way to speak. Imagine standing at Xiaohe around 4,000 years ago. Not as a tourist, not as a scientist, but as someone living there. The desert is not empty. It breathes heat. The horizon shifts, river channels move, oases shrink, swell, and disappear. Survival depends on knowing where water will still be when the sun has finished with the land. Around you are animals, cattle, sheep, goats. There is milk, perhaps fermented into something that lasts longer in the heat. There is wool against the cold nights. There are baskets instead of much pottery. There are hides, posts, coffins, and the strange vertical markers of a burial world whose meaning we can still only partially understand. A child born there would not have thought of herself as a mystery. She would have known the smell of animals, the taste of milk, the danger of thirst, the routes between water and pasture, the names of kin, the stories of the dead, the shape of the desert in every season. She would not have known that thousands of years later, strangers would argue about whether she belonged to the east or the west. That argument belonged to us, not to her. Somewhere in the ancestry of that child was a thread that ran back not to the western steppe, not to the oasis cities, not to a recent migration that could be drawn with an arrow across a map, but to one of the deepest surviving layers of northern Eurasian prehistory, a thread from a world that had largely disappeared. And yet, there, in the Tarim Basin, it had endured. That is what makes the face so unsettling. The most disturbing thing about the Princess of Zhao He is not that she looks strange. It is that she looks present, not like a skeleton, not like an artifact, like someone interrupted by death and preserved before time could finish its work. That is why the mummies became famous. They did not feel abstract. They looked back. Their preservation collapsed the distance between the Bronze Age and the present. A face that should have dissolved into dust remained visible enough for modern people to project stories onto it. And we did. We projected migration. We projected language. We projected race. We projected the need for a clean explanation. But ancient DNA forces us to be careful with that gaze. A face is not a passport. Clothing is not ancestry. Language is not blood. And DNA, powerful as it is, cannot assign modern identity to Bronze Age bones. This is not a story about modern politics. It is not a story about modern nations, borders, ethnicity, or ownership. It is a story about human remains, archaeological evidence, and what ancient DNA can and cannot tell us. DNA can describe ancestry. It cannot by itself tell us what language a person spoke. It cannot tell us what name they used for themselves. It cannot tell us what they believed. It cannot make them into a modern group. And it cannot turn the dead into weapons for arguments they never lived to have. The Tarim Mummies belong to their own world. A Bronze Age world of sand, river, wool, milk, baskets, cattle hides, wooden coffins, and desert survival. A world connected to distant technologies but rooted in a genetic past that had almost vanished elsewhere. That is what makes them extraordinary. Not that they came from the West, but that they did not have to. For generations, the mystery was framed in terms of arrival. Who came here? Which migrants crossed the mountains? Which Western people brought the strange clothing, the dairy, the wool, the face that seemed out of place? The DNA changed the question. Maybe the real mystery was not who arrived. Maybe it was who remained. That is a harder story to tell, because survival is quieter than invasion. It does not move across maps with arrows. It does not announce itself with conquest. It does not always leave a language behind for us to read. Sometimes survival looks like a small community holding together at the edge of a desert while everything around it changes. The steppe moved. The oasis worlds exchanged goods and ideas. Pastoralist networks expanded. Crops crossed ecological borders. Technologies traveled. And inside the Tarim Basin, a deeply rooted population absorbed the world without being genetically swallowed by it. That is not isolation in the primitive sense. That is selectivity. That is adaptation. That is human life doing what human life has always done, borrowing, reshaping, surviving, and making a local world out of distant materials. The old story needed the Tarim mummies to be outsiders because their faces seemed too strange, their clothes too unexpected, their economy too connected. But the ancient genome did not care what the face suggested. It carried a record older than appearance, older than clothing, older than the categories modern people brought to the graves. The molecule does not flatter our assumptions. It simply remembers. And what it remembered was not a clean migration from the West, but a population whose history reached further down into Eurasian time than anyone expected. The Tarim mummies were not mysterious because they were foreigners in the desert. They were mysterious because they carried a genetic memory older than the cultures surrounding them. They were not isolated primitives. Their material world was full of borrowed, adapted, and transformed ideas. They were not simply Indo-European migrants. Their earliest genomes do not support that clean story. They were not a solved riddle. They were evidence that the Bronze Age was more complicated than the maps we drew for it. The desert preserved their faces. Ancient DNA preserved the part of the story their faces could not tell. And together they reveal something stranger than the old myth. A people genetically rooted in one of Eurasia's oldest surviving lineages, living at the crossroads of foods, animals, technologies, and beliefs from across the ancient world. Not outsiders, not ghosts, not proof of a simple migration, but survivors of an older world, standing at the edge of a desert, carrying a past so deep that the living mistook it for something foreign. The Tarim Mummies were never who we thought, because what we thought was too small. And in the end, that may be the most honest thing ancient DNA can tell us. Not that the mystery is over, but that the mystery was always larger than the face in the sand.